certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Kira Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
More than 1,000 fibres were found in Jane Rimmer's hair. Today, court heard about those that are critical to the prosecution case. Natalie Bonjolo, Tim Clark and forensic scientist Brendan Chapman with you today. So Tim, this was a bit of a staggering number to hear, 1,000 fibres in Jane's hair alone.
Yeah, that's right, Nat. And it illustrated a little bit what we've been talking about the last couple of days about the minute and minuscule work that the ChemCentre guys have done on this case over the many years, and this was, as you say, from Jane's hair mass that was teased and tweezed and having been in storage for 13 years, we must remind people. But once it was out of storage, pulled apart, literally placed into 5 different areas, and then examined in many different ways: polilight, shaking. Several levels of microscopy, and then today we also heard that there was a wash and filtration system as well, and through all of that, over 1,000 fibres were discovered, spotted, found, placed on slides and placed in the database. That number was so large that Rhys Powell from the ChemCentre, who was continuing his evidence today, said that they had to basically start again when it came to numbering them all, because they couldn't go over a 3-digit number, which would illustrate probably or possibly how rare it is to get this many fibres off one exhibit, but they did. And then they boiled them down eventually after Mr. Edwards was arrested to it's 22 critical fibres in Jane's case from the more than 1,000 that they found. But that obviously meant that every one of those more than 1,000 had to be individually labelled, looked at, and then compared to everything else, which again goes to illustrate exactly why maybe they built this database around the macro exhibits, because to do that by hand or by eye, we'd probably still be waiting for them to finish the work now.
Yeah. Brendan, why could it be that there were so many fibres found in this hair mass? Is it that ordinarily you wouldn't have a hair mass like this?
Like if I was just to kind of spitball around a mass of hair as an exhibit or as a forensic item, I suppose, that it certainly is a perfect receptacle for all sorts of microscopic evidence, be that fibres, be that pollen, be that dust, which can essentially be composed of foreign DNA, because hair is, I suppose, when you think about the surface area of a mass of hair, there's quite a lot of space for things to get caught there. Most hair has hair will have some sort of natural oil content to it. That's not to rule out hair products and things like that, which can help things adhere to the hair surface or the mass. So I'm not surprised by those numbers. I'm not familiar with whether that's normal or not, but it certainly doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, it just does seem like an extraordinary amount. And Tim, you mentioned this process of wash and filtration, and this was a question asked by Justice Hall about how each individual fibre was found. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what Mr. Powell had to say about that system?
Yeah, we hadn't heard about this system, or certainly not in detail anyway. So after the hair had been teased and tweezed and shaken, the scientists at the ChemCentre decided to go one stage further to see if there was anything left, and it turned out that there very much was. So they placed the hair into different sections and then broke those sections down again. And it was a system called vacuum filtration. The way Mr. Powell described it was the hair was placed in a receptacle, washed through with detergent and water in the receptacle where there was a piece of filter paper there to catch any material that was washed through. The fluid itself that was washed through the hair was also kept, and then on that, what was left on that filter paper, the solid material, if you like, was then dried out and then inspected again under the same microscopes. And as Mr. Powell described today, several of the critical fibres that are now part of the prosecution case were found in this way. These are the grey polyester fibres that are said to come from Mr. Edwards' car, and similar to the ones, also some of the ones found on Kira as well, and also obviously similar to the ones found in Jane's hair via other methods. So the lengths again that the guys at the ChemCentre went through and went to make sure that they didn't miss anything. Again, that illustrated how far they were willing to go and did go.
Yeah, because Brendan, you've spoken to us about the polilight and tweezers and the various ways that they can collect fibres. In terms of this filtration process, is this par for the course, or is this really something that they have done that has really pushed it forward in terms of capturing extra fibres?
It's probably not something that we use all the time, but I certainly have used that technique before to kind of wash off. I'm going to use the word debris, but it's certainly not in the sense of something being not wanted or wasted. Basically, with things like filters, we can in labs and throughout various different sciences, there's a huge range of filters available to us that basically we can set the size of what we want to pass through them, and we can get filters that are so non-porous, I suppose, that they can flow liquid through and actually trap molecules as small as DNA and proteins. So we can scale that up, obviously, depending on what we're looking at catching. So these filter devices are not uncommon to forensics, and I certainly have used them before, not in the case of a hair mass as such, but certainly have done washings, or what we would call washings, in a post-mortem situation. I think it was hair, in fact, but it was still attached to a deceased person, where you can basically wash the hair, and as they've talked about in court today, obviously, is to then catch everything that runs off and use these filters essentially as a kind of sieve, I suppose, to catch anything of a particular size and larger. So it's not a technique that's unheard of, but it's certainly not a hugely popular, or not popular, but a regularly used technique.
Yeah. Tim, you said of the 1,000+ fibres that they found in Jane Rimmer's hair, 22 of those were critical. Mm-hmm. How many of these critical fibres did Rhys Powell get through today?
Well, we were on the very last one, Nat, when we wrapped up for the day at about 4 o'clock. So, yeah, we went through one, as we've said, warned some of the listeners. We did go through everyone one by one today, but a lot of that was very similar evidence, because 20 of those 22 critical fibres attached to Jane were the grey polyester type fibres that the prosecution say were all from the car seat insert, that particular part of Mr. Edwards' car. And so the way that they've been doing it is that they introduce the fibre, They introduce where it was found, or what it was, where it was found, who found it, on what day, and then what process was done to find it. And then they go through the comparisons. Then they detail to the court when this fibre was identified, what then was it compared to in the database. And that is what is taking up much of the time, is that those comparisons are detailed, and then the photographs to go with those comparisons are detailed. And so, for instance, with the 20 grey polyester fibres, some of them were compared to other fibres found on Kira, for instance, but most of them were just compared to the sample fibres from Mr. Edwards' car. And so, yeah, that's what the vast majority of the evidence was today, was going through those fibres one by one. And we are currently on the last one, and that is a slightly different fibre. That's a blue-grey polypropylene fibre, which the prosecution says comes from the boot area of Mr. Edwards' car. And so that one, we didn't finish, because there are a lot more comparisons that were done to that fibre, because that is the only type of this fibre that it was found on any of the victims anywhere. So it is literally unique, that one blue-grey polypropylene fibre. So that would have to be compared to many more things, and we think other styles and types of cars and carpet connected to the case, to try and narrow it down right down to that is the only place it could have come from.
Right. And so in that evidence, did Mr. Powell say that this was a corresponding match?
Yes, he did. That it was when they found this fibre and then found the car, the comparison was run quite soon after they found the car, actually, in February 2017. Mr. Powell ran that comparison himself. And what they compared it to was, if you can imagine the back seat of your car, when you fold it down to make more space in the boot, the carpet that was on the back of the passenger side of that folded down boot, that was sampled, compared to this one tiny single fibre found in Jane's hair, and that was said to correspond. So that is what the prosecution says is proof that is where in that fibre would have come from and could have come from. But as we mentioned yesterday, they will probably tomorrow spend some time disproving possibly other possible sources, because there were various other samples of other cars and other carpets connected to the case sampled, and then obviously a comparison would have been made. So that's what we'll hear about in the morning.
Right. Brendan, in yesterday's podcast, Tim explained to us how Mr. Powell described a match or a corresponding fibre, and Tim told us that, to the naked eye and to see the photographs, they look identical. Can you just talk to us about seeing an identical match and how you match up fibres?
Yeah, so the word match is an interesting word, and I'll have to admit, I kind of avoid using the word match because it does conjure an idea of something being completely unique, and it's a match. It had to have originated from that source, and that's not necessarily the case. I kind of used an analogy to my students with regards to this, whereby if you stand on an overpass of a freeway for 2 weeks and you collect data or you write down every colour, every make, every model of car that passes through, and you have this huge data set after a couple of weeks of all these cars that have passed through, and then you can see another car and look at your database or your data and say, oh yeah, that's a match, it matches it. But what you don't know about are the cars that have never passed under that bridge. And so that's why I don't like to use the word match per se. But but I also appreciate that when we're talking in a courtroom, we need to kind of convert our scientific terminology into something that a jury, or in this case, a judge, who I would respectfully not call a layperson, but we need to kind of convert it into a language that everyone can understand. And so match is the most direct association, I suppose, you can make. But what's important to say is kind of the caveat that goes with that, which is, well, we've looked at X number of features, and that might be the colour, that might be how it's made, that might be the length, it might be the luster, all the sort of features that we can look at with regards to a fibre or any piece of evidence, and we can say on the basis of those features, it is a match. And so that's kind of some of the nuances around that. What that doesn't tell us is where something originated from. We can say that two things match on those characteristics, but we can't necessarily then infer further from that that came from, therefore, vehicle X or person Y. And that's where this then gets thrown to the jury, or in this case, a judge, to weigh that up on the basis of that evidence and obviously all of the other associated evidence with the case. Because if it really was as simple as a match, that's the source and this is what it is, then we actually probably wouldn't need juries and judges, because it pretty much points the finger straight away.
Yeah, it would be cut and dry, wouldn't it? And I think in terms of the layperson, yes, that is me, and I may be using the word match, but Tim, I think Rhys Powell probably hasn't used the word match, has he? Or
no, correspond. Correspond is the word.
Yeah.
Corresponding items or properties is the word of the week.
Consistent with is another one we love to use. Consistent with.
Yeah. So correspond, similar, and differ. They're the three. They're the red light, green light, and amber light that Mr. Powell has been using. And as we touched on it last night, and Brendan's exactly right that they could never. You would think that the prosecution would never go as far as saying that is definitely from the car, because you simply couldn't. But as Brendan's just again pointed out there, this is a portion of the evidence, a big portion, a crucial portion, but a portion nonetheless. And eventually, when we do get through all these different fibres and then get to the end of the prosecution case, it will then be brought all together, along with the DNA, along with the circumstantial evidence, along with the Telstra living witnesses, along with everything else that we've gone through in the past 5 months, 6 months. You look at it and say, we for instance, we picked this car 2 years before Mr. Edwards was arrested. We've got Mr. Edwards' DNA, and then lo and behold, it was that car that he happened to own at the times of the murders. That's what the prosecution will point to as the many ducks that they are trying to line up all in a row.
Yes. So we know that there are, in this portion of the trial, there are 98 critical fibres, and you've told us that 22 of those come from Jane and what they're being compared to. Can you break down the rest of those 98 fibres, who they come from, where they come from, and what they'll be compared to?
Yeah. So, yes, 22 from Jane. They're the ones we've gone through in the last 2 days. 20 of those grey polyester, which are said to come from the car seat insert. That's the middle patterned portion of the seats in that Holden Commodore. The blue-grey polypropylene, which I just mentioned, which is said to come from the car boot. And the one blue polyester, which is said to come from the Telstra pants. And so that makes up the 22 in Jane, from Jane. 2 more of those blue polyester fibres were found on the shorts of the Karrakatta victim at 2 separate times, 2 separate tape lifts from those shorts, again from the Telstra pants, and 13 more of those blue polyester fibres were then found actually in Mr. Edwards' old car. And then the rest of the critical fibres are all related to Kira. 33 of the blue polyester fibres, the Telstra pants fibres, were found in her hair, allegedly. 11 further blue polyester fibres were found on her shirt. That was done via scrapings done by the FBI in 1999, which were then placed in petri dishes, sent back to Australia, and eventually analysed by the ChemCentre. Then we've got grey polyester. Again, grey polyester fibres similar to the ones found on Jane. 3 of those were found in her hair, in Kira's hair, I should say. Now, there were 6, this is a new one, 6 blue non-delustered rayon fibres. They are said to correspond to the shorts, the fabric used to make the Telstra shorts that Mr. Edwards would have worn at the time. And then the last 8 critical fibres are again a polypropylene of both light and dark coloration, and they are said to have come from the carpet in the cabin of the car, the footwells, and they were also found in Kira's hair. So you can see all the various areas and all the various sources and all the various places that they were found, and that took years and years and years. It sounds pretty easy when you can sum it up in like 2 or 3 minutes, but that basically from 1996 when Jane's hair was first secured, 97 when Kira's hair and shirt was secured. We're looking at a trip to America, a trip to Canberra, then back to Perth. 3 years worth of work at the ChemCentre between 2009 and 2012 on Jane's hair, a similar amount of time and work on Kira's hair. That took them up to 2014 when they had a report to the police. Then you've got 2-year gap until Mr. Edwards was arrested, and then basically all that work is done again, but with source material this time from the Telstra pants and Telstra shorts and the car, brings us literally up to weeks before the trial was due to start. The ChemCentre was still doing that work. Then they were given a little extension on the deadline. They were still doing work right up to that deadline. And the report from the defence fibre expert was only sent across to the prosecution in December last year, in the middle of the trial. So, I mean, this fibre evidence spans so many years, and it comes down to 98 tiny little fibres found in various bits over all those years.
I mean, it's just extraordinary and painstaking work, and we've discussed, just how the fibre evidence, it is actually quite dry to sit and listen to. Brendan, do fibre trials always go hand in hand with DNA evidence, and is one sort of, gets more of the glory and is considered a little bit more sexy than the other?
In my mind, DNA is certainly sexier, but I might be a little bit biased. I can't really speak for what you call fibre trials per se, Nat, but certainly any protracted homicide case does yield a huge amount of evidence that needs to be put to trial, particularly if there's not a plea deal taken or a guilty plea entered, and it does go to full trial. I don't know. It's a tough one because I seem to recall people complaining about how boring the DNA evidence was to listen to.
You must be mixing me up with someone else, Brendan, I'm sure.
So I think it's just the nature of a lot of forensic science is that some of the work is incredibly painstaking and meticulous, and if it wasn't, then we wouldn't be doing our job as forensic scientists correctly. So I think it's more a feature of the legal system. I'm going to pass the buck there and say that because we really do have this burden of proof and ensuring that everything we do is completely transparent. And with transparency, unfortunately, comes some of the unsexiness.
and Tim, tell us, is Justice Hall, handling this fibre evidence well?
As usual, Matt, he's absolutely seems to be across it all, interjecting with questions when he feels he needs to. He's made a couple of asides to Ms. Barbara Gallo about how long it's going to take, and there was also another exchange at the end of today with Justice Hall trying to get a guesstimate of how long it would take, the way he phrased it was how long Mr. Rees-Powell would be with us, and then corrected himself by saying, "I mean in terms of the trial, not in terms of in general terms." So, which was a bit of brevity at the end of a long day, I have to say. Ms. Barbara Gallo has basically said she thinks Mr. Powell will be still with us this time next week, next Thursday, which that's how long everything is going to take, because there are other things that he will talk about after we've gone through every fibre. So, as Brendan said, I mean, it's forensic science for a reason. The exactitude is why it is so important and so valued in the criminal justice system, and so relied upon in some regards, and the exactitude means that sometimes it is not as sexy, if that is the word of the day, than maybe some of the emotional upset evidence we got at the start of the trial, but it's certainly as important, if probably more so, as Miss Barbara Gallo pointed out to me last week. It's crucial, but don't expect to be entertained.
And what about Bradley Edwards' interest in this fibre evidence? Is he taking notes as usual?
Yeah, he certainly is. Yep, and his lawyers, his defence team is certainly taking notice of those notes at the breaks as well. But it's, as I say, there are a lot of very similar pictures, a lot of very similar words and phraseology. But he's very much as engaged as he has been the whole way through. Certainly in terms of what he is writing, and obviously some observations that he's passing on to his solicitors, who then pass them on to the barristers.
Yeah. In terms of what's coming up next, if I've done my maths correctly, then 61 of these 98 critical fibres are in relationship to the fibres found on Keira Glennon in her hair mass and her shirt. Is that the next portion of the fibre evidence?
Yeah. So we'll make a start on that tomorrow, we think, but we won't get very far with it. We're not entirely sure whether we're going to sit tomorrow afternoon. We haven't been sitting Friday afternoons for the entirety of the trial, so Justice Hall hasn't made any mention of whether he's going to change that just to try and get through it. As I say, it's been a long week, and mostly for Mr. Powell, who's giving all this evidence. I mean, we have to acknowledge that he's been very clear, very prosaic in the way that he's presented it. It's easy to understand. It might not be essentially interesting to listen to sometimes, but it has been very easy to follow, which is why no doubt that the prosecution has sort of picked on him as one of their main fibre witnesses, and he'll keep going well into next week. So but we will make a start on some of the fibres found on Keira tomorrow, and we'll be on them for a few days to come.
And would he be the longest person on the stand by the time he's finished giving his evidence?
It might well be, Nat.
Yeah.
You're testing my thing there. I mean, you're testing my memory there. I mean, he started on Tuesday, so it'll be a full week, and then almost 8-9 days on the stand. So he'll certainly be in the top 5. I will have to I'll have to consult my media colleagues to see whether he'll be straight in at number 1 and with a bullet as the longest Claremont witness.
Well, he's being very stoic about it all. Thank you both so much for your company today, and thank you. We'll be back tomorrow with Tim and with Alison Fan, and we look forward to chatting with you then for day 74 of Claremont in Conversation. conversation.
This podcast was produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
Enjoying this podcast? If the story behind the headline matters to you, then you can count on thewest.com.au to deliver. For more on Claremont the trial, follow the live blog, watch the nightly news updates, and sign up for daily email updates at thewest.com.au. Subscribe now for just $1 a day at thewest.com.au.